gain muscle. Think about someone that is quite inactive, but they suddenly increase their protein intake. So can someone without training have the potential to gain muscle just by eating more protein?
Yeah, they can, but they would have to be, number one, untrained, and number two, they would have to have a history of suboptimal protein intake. So if you take a trained individual with a history of high protein intake, you can't just simply push the protein higher and see increases in muscle protein or lean body mass for that matter. But they've actually observed increases in lean body mass as a result of escalating intakes of protein in sedentary, untrained individuals. And this is a study by Bray and colleagues a few years back.
I find this very fascinating because obviously I work in the clinical world and I see elderly and patients that obviously eat suboptimally protein. And they are hospitalized, they are likely at higher risk of lean body mass losses. And usually we come with a recommendation that even if they're bed bound or they are unlikely able to do resistance training or any sort of activity, to continue to try to increase their protein intake and prioritize that as their biggest strategy to prevent muscle loss. So my question would be, are we doing the right thing by recommending higher protein intake, especially in these individuals that are more likely to lose lean body mass in hospital?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the benefits far outweigh the downsides. And with situations like that, you just have to take the calculated risks, you know, and so the, in quotes, risks with higher protein intake are very small, you know, especially for the human organism. I mean, we take care of protein just fine.
How eating more and moving more sometimes can lead to impressive body composition changes, whilst we always hear that if you want to change your body composition, you need to eat less and move more to create a bigger deficit. But somehow, when we implement these strategies of actually moving more, but eating more, makes a huge difference in people's physique. Obviously, this is very individual and context dependent, but give me your take on this. Why sometimes this strategy can be so helpful and beneficial to still improve body composition changes in an individual?
That's a great question. And it's a concept called energy flux. So low energy flux, very low energy flux at the extreme low end would be somebody who is bedridden and is eating enough calories to maintain their bedridden state. Okay, so that's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you have somebody who's training 4 hours a day and they're eating enough calories to maintain their body weight at their extremely high training volume. So let's take something a little bit more reasonable. Somebody who's training about an hour a day, and an hour a day up to, like, let's say 90 minutes a day up to 2 hours a day. So that's a pretty high energy flux. So there are very distinct adaptations that take place. The body has to deal with the stress of the training stimulus, as opposed to having to not deal with any training stimulus at all, or a very low training stimulus. So the body has to deal with the training stimulus or adapt to it musculoskeletally, cardiovascularly, and then even at the micro level, mitochondrially. And so these adaptations ultimately equal drastic morphological differences, increased bone density, increased muscle mass, and much better nutrient partitioning differences. Because of increases in mitochondrial activity, the body can just use fuels a lot more favorably. And so incoming energy gets partitioned towards the lean tissue more instead of the fat tissue. And so the body just becomes this machine that's designed to adapt to training stresses. And so you're essentially looking at a superhero versus just sort of a piece of sludge on a bed. So that's kind of the difference between low and high energy flux.
I wonder whether that is kind of like a part of the principle why we use reverse dieting as a way to not just improve someone's metabolic profile and energy expenditure, feeling better overall, reducing that chances for them to engage forever with dieting or low calorie intake. And I personally, in my coaching experience, I've seen how people just sometimes by stopping dieting and just working on moving more, optimizing their training, feeling better, automatically leads to for them to be in a much better environment for them to build more muscle, being leaner, but also they are more consistent. For me, when I think about the emotional aspect and the consistency aspect, that's what it makes more sense to me when we think about eating more, but also moving more. And moving more, not just for the sake of burning and earning your calories, but more so because you are feeling that there's more energy in your system, that you feel that you can train harder, that you can push yourself harder in the gym and get yourself in a much better physique state. So what do you think about utilizing this in this context, I guess?
I think it's very powerful and very effective to be able to have somebody exist at a higher energy flux. This is because, and one of the biggest things, and this is something that's actually been observed in research, is that even when you take two groups of people at the same energy balance, let's say somebody is maintaining, both groups are in maintenance caloric balance, but one group has higher training energy expenditure alongside with a greater energy intake. So this group, which is at a higher energy flux, because of their greater energy intake, they actually have a better controlled appetite. They are not as hungry as the group with a lower energy expenditure and a lower energy intake, even though they're both at the same maintenance energy balance. And so that control of appetite and hunger is a huge difference. And so that is a major advantage to being at a higher energy flux level.
Shifting again the question, when you think that someone is in a fat loss phase or in a calorie deficit, how important or protective that resistance training, or what's the role of resistance training for preventing lean body mass loss in a calorie deficit? Is that super, super important, or can a high protein diet compete against resistance training? If someone wouldn't do resistance or engaged with resistance training, would be enough just to have high protein diets, or resistance training is the deal?
That is a great question, and the answer, I'm going to try not to complicate it. They both are crucially important to the process of maintaining lean body mass and maintaining good results in the dieting process. So resistance training might have a greater magnitude of effect than, keeping your protein at a decent level, let's say 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight or more. Resistance training would still have a greater magnitude of effect. So if for some stupid reason you were forced to choose one, resistance training, it would have a stronger effect than the protein effect. So resistance training effect is stronger than protein effect. But if you get both in place, you will have much better results, and you'll be able to progress better, and you'll be able to maintain your fat loss better because you'll be more satiated. Lean mass will be better supported. Muscle protein turnover will better be supported. And those two factors will join forces for much better results. So I don't like to pit those factors against each other, even though resistance training has a stronger effect than protein does. I like to think of it as you need to do both.
Because I've seen this in my coaching too. When I get clients that they are likely to perhaps engage with resistance training, but for some reason eating protein is just a job and another job to get more protein. It is like we can give them recommendations and give them strategies to increase it, and still I can see they are falling under the targets that we set up for them. So that's why when it comes to bring this conversation up to talk about, well, why you should be prioritizing not just a higher protein intake, but a good amount of resistance training, is like, well, they ask this question: what happens if I just prioritize much more resistance training and I don't eat enough protein. Let's say they're eating protein, but suboptimally, let's say under 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is under the recommendations.
Mm-hmm. They can, I mean, they could still reach their goals, but the process will be slower. Once they reach the goals, they won't necessarily have the best chance of maintaining the goal. So it's a matter of how smart do you want to play this? How optimal do you want the results? And sometimes it comes down to, with this particular issue that you mentioned, it just comes down to teaching people how to get the protein in. And sometimes it involves supplementation. Sometimes it involves having them recognize the foods that are high enough in protein, that are easy enough and convenient enough to be able to prepare and have on hand. I mean, you and I, we know it's easy to get like 30 to 60 grams of protein in one hit by a million different ways. You know, you do that 3-4 times a day, you're at or beyond the amount of protein you need. So people just need to kind of learn how to do that.
It's easier when you have the strategies in place. And some people think that they have to be eating meat or things that are just kind of like outside the range of foods that they would normally eat. But it can be much simpler than that if you put the right strategies in place, like just doubling up on what you already eat. That is as simple as that. Or just choosing, nowadays we see a wide range of products that are designed to be higher protein that are not naturally high in protein, like cereals or oats or just, I don't know, baking powder that is higher protein. So you can choose a few things that kind of boost your protein intake that are not necessarily meat.
Yes, agree. And people have the wrong ideas in their mind about how it's attained. And gosh, you know, just even adding a couple of protein shakes to your day can take care of the issue. And if you know how to make delicious protein shakes, then you'll look forward to these meals.
Gaining weight or gaining muscle, is there much of a difference when we think about the quality of those extra calories that we're adding to the surplus? So would make any difference when we think about body composition to make that surplus based on that being carbohydrate, fat, or protein? Is there any meaningful difference when we think about the result on body composition at the end of let's say 12 weeks? Would that be a difference?
Yes, and it depends on the individual's propensity to put on body fat in a surplus. So if we look at two opposite ends of the continuum here, with one individual puts on fat by just looking at food, okay? That individual may want to emphasize protein in the surplus. And this is because of a couple factors plus maybe some magic. So the couple factors would be the effect that protein has on thermogenesis, the effect it has on satiety, the effect that it has potentially on recomposition, and the fact that this person, because they gain fat so easily, it would be a little bit safer to base their surplus on a higher protein intake because of their tendency to overeat the surplus. And there is a good amount of evidence out of Joey Antonio's lab showing how protein-based surpluses are actually quite difficult to gain weight on in free living conditions amongst resistance trainees. So if you're worried about somebody gaining too much fat during a surplus, then you protein up their surplus, basically. Now, you take somebody else who's on the complete other end of the spectrum, an in quotes hard gainer, a classic ectomorph, and I will put that in quotes because, you know, body types are really just a default of lifestyle. I mean, genetics play a role, but it's lifestyle plus genetics, with lifestyle being the stronger factor in terms of, you know, these in quotes body type. So your classic hard gainer, their surplus, you would want to keep protein at a good level, right? Approximately a gram per pound of target body weight, but with their surplus being a much more palatable surplus, maybe a combination of a carb and fat-based surplus. So they are not having such a hard time taking down those extra calories. Because a lot of times with these hard gainer types, they have a greater tendency to ramp up subconsciously their non-exercise activity in response to an imposed caloric surplus. And so they just kind of do it automatically, subconsciously. And a lot of these folks are able to take like a 200 to 500 calorie energy surplus and just eliminate it by extra movement. And sometimes they eliminate higher surpluses than that. So you, in those cases, then base the surplus on something a little more palatable, a little more carb, fat-focused surplus, or you can mess around with the proportions there. But those are the two scenarios that I would kind of keep in mind as far as programming how you're going to increase the calories and where you're going to draw those increases from.
And I guess the level of surplus also can dictate how much your body composition changes. There are people that may benefit more from just a small surplus, just enough to get them in a gaining phase without creating an extra fat gain. Whereas we have another group of people that those that you mentioned, the hard gainers, that may require a more significant, larger surplus for them to actually see a decent progress.
Yeah.
I've got a challenge now that when we think about women in a gaining phase, this is another level of a challenge because of how gaining weight and looking at the scale significantly impacts how women perceive their own body weight and the body image. And for some reason, the scale seems to have a larger impact on how you feel about your progress, even though you know that there is a purpose behind it.
Yeah.
How do you approach a gaining phase or creating the amount of the surplus you want to choose from a female athlete? Or maybe just not so much a female athlete, but more so just a gen pop females that they've been dieting for years, they need to put on some muscle, they need to put on some weight. You tend to go to the side of conservative, or do you move a little bit more to the moderate to aggressive?
I actually would approach it the same way, because there are some female hard gainers as well as females who have a high tendency to put on body fat. So I would approach it a similar way, but I do agree that women tend to get a little more psychologically affected by increases in scale weight. And this is just a socio-cultural phenomenon. So what can really help in this case is just establishing and just sort of reminding individuals that we're looking at changes in body composition. And so changes in scale weight is just a piece of the puzzle. And so there are some great shots that I actually use in my seminars of a friend of mine named Kate Cavers, who a picture of her before she started training, and then a picture of her 6 years into training. And there's almost a 10-pound increase in her scale weight from the untrained state to the trained state, but she looks worlds better in the trained state at 9 pounds heavier than before she started training. And for people to just have a visual like that, and for people to see that, it can be really powerful in changing their perception, the negative perception that they ascribe to increases in scale weight. So, and you can even give just sort of these visual kind of mental examples of the differences in density between muscle and body fat. And so if you can think of a quarter or a $50 coin weighing more than a sponge, but you can look at the visual differences between the sponge and the quarter, for example. It's a similar principle with muscle and body fat. Not as dramatic in real life, but it gets the message across. And so, yeah, I wouldn't use any different techniques, but sometimes people need to be counseled and reminded on the focus on body composition and visuals versus just mere changes in scale weight.
Thinking about a newbie or a beginner that is trying to lose weight, especially let's think about a female that is engaging with, for the first time, with a bit of new resistance training and changing their lifestyle, eating more protein. How likely is for them to struggle with the even though they lose in body fat, they seem to struggle with the fact that the scale is moving so slow that they feel like they're not really getting anywhere, but they do because of these newbie gains that we see in beginners. How would you approach, or what are some of your strategies to try to identify whether this person may be actually recomping and not that they are not adherent or not losing weight?
This is where a combination of assessment methods becomes important. In my practice remotely, I've relied on the scale, pictures, and circumference. So mainly waist circumference, and you can take other circumferences of limbs and such, and arms, legs, and stuff, but waist circumference is a telling indicator of body fat level. The big picture is literally the picture. So the picture would be like a monthly assessment. And if you can correlate visual changes in the picture, you can ask the person, especially if they are in a work environment where they're around people or even just their family members, you can even ask them, has anybody commented on a change in your looks? Yes. Yes, they have. And that's kind of a powerful reminder, because that is that's an objective, that's an unsolicited indicator, and it's a powerful indicator that changes are happening, whether you know it or not. And so if somebody is recomping, then they will see, and you know, lifting performance is another variable that you can add to scale weight and waist circumference and pictures. So if your lifting capacity or lifting performance is increasing while your body weight is staying the same and your waist circumference is decreasing, then that is almost a certain set of indicators that would show recomposition. In other words, the loss of body fat and gain of muscle at roughly the same rate if the scale is staying the same. So you can use these tools to show people that, look, this is objectively what's happening. And hey, look, even your sister, who's a tough customer, she noticed it. Or your coworker, Bob, who's an asshole, he even said something cool. And so, yeah, those are just a few indicators that progress is happening.
I love that. Now, where are we in terms of the research around spot reduction? I know that we have debunked this over and over, but I think that there are people out there trying to still find a bit more about whether is this actually possible at some level. So do you have any updates perhaps that you're aware of around this specific topic?
The spot reduction objective is often done with training protocols, or it can be done with topical creams and such. But the kind of the big picture is that the training protocols, most of them have been debunked. Most of them have been debunked in the literature. So for the most part, the muscles that are being trained do not own, in quotes, the subcutaneous fat tissue sitting on top of them. No matter what type of protocol you try to employ. I mean, if that was the case, then we would see this difference happen with extreme amounts of volume placed on the legs, for example, in cycling type of protocols, or in leg press type of protocols, or the abs in endless sit-ups type of protocols, or even think about mandibular muscles, the jaw muscles. You know, people are chewing all gosh damn day. If you have put somebody on a chewing protocol, it's not as if their face will start thinning out. So it does come down to, for all practical purposes, a reduction in overall body fat if somebody wants to see a reduction of body fat in a specific area. I hate to say, but I would just ditch the whole idea that you can target a specific area for body fat loss without targeting overall fat loss. It's just a futile and frustrating and fruitless endeavor.
It's interesting that we can target where to put on muscle, but we cannot target where to lose body fat, because it kind of seems counterintuitive. But do you think that argument would be right to say, like, you can target where to put on muscle, or you cannot?
Yes, you can absolutely target where to put on muscle, because that is a regional, that's a regional phenomenon. However, body fat and its level, its change is a systemic phenomenon.